I got bad news for some people because sometimes this toxic stress is generational. You're born with it.
When your body has released cortisol and you have high levels of cortisol for prolonged periods of time, you actually will eat away at your brain.
It does sound gross.
It sounds horrible, but it's really happening.
Wow.
People are doing that. And we have a lot of mental health providers in BrainCore that have incorporated neurofeedback, and the things that they're telling me are just amazing in terms of the results they're getting.
Hey, welcome back, everybody. This is Real Brain Talk with Dr. Guy, Dr. Ken, owners of BrainCore Neurofeedback. And today, we're going to talk about toxic stress. This came up, Guy, because I reviewed 3 cases with our members today, and all 3 were children under the age of 10, and their map showed a tremendous amount of toxic stress. And what that looks like is that with their eyes closed, the delta brainwave is just high all over the map. Their entire brain is inflamed. It's like the brain is on fire. It is just using up all of the, fuel to create this inflammatory condition, and it's making the rest of the brain suffer. Usually when we see this, it's a gut brain axis problem. It's a sleep issue. It creates all kinds of issues with attention, with any type of focus, impulsivity, anxiety behaviors. It's a big problem, and I've seen so much of it lately.
Yeah, and I don't know how to explain it. I don't know. I mean, what is toxic stress, right? Toxic stress is, a prolonged state of being in a stressful environment over a long period of time. And when your body is in a stressful environment, it's going to release certain hormones, specifically cortisol. And the purpose of cortisol is to basically help you in that stressful environment. So, back when we were cavemen, a lion would come up and your body would release cortisol, and you would do one of 2 things. You would either run or you'd fight, right? So we talk about that as the fight or flight experience. And it emanates from cortisol being released as a result of stress. But what's happening in our society is that we are constantly under stress, or at least perceived stress. And because of that constant perceived stress, we have those prolonged levels of cortisol, high levels of cortisol in our bodies. And that can lead to horrible consequences for the body.
Right, without the burn off, right? Because if you're not fighting or flight, or if you're not fight or flight, you're not burning off that cortisol. Think about just this. Think about all the video game, that's right. I mean, you're sitting there, you're battling, you're fighting.
Perceived stress.
Perceived fighting, stress. Right. Yeah. Right. But you're not out. You really need to put that game down, go run around the block and come back to try to get that cortisol level back down.
Right. But that's funny you bring that up, because it's so important to differentiate between real stress and perceived stress, because the perception of stress is different for every person, right? What I perceive as being stressful, you may not perceive as being stressful, but still being in those video games, when you're in them, I mean, you're stressed, your body's stressed. Did you ever watch a movie that has captured you so much that you start to feel different? Your body feels different?
Yeah, those typically good movies.
Yeah. And you're like, sometimes I see my foot shaking and I'm like, oh my God, I'm having like a stress reaction to this movie that I know is not even real.
My wife, she doesn't like to go to the movies. And I suspect it's because they affect her a lot. But so she's either falls asleep, or I've seen her in action movies where somebody throws a punch and I see her, she's dodging it. And I'm like, you're okay. Yeah. But it's stressful.
So physiologically, what's going on there? Well, you got the release of cortisol. Okay, we said the release of cortisol is good in the right situation, but in a prolonged situation, the release of cortisol is not good. And what does it do to your body? So from a brain perspective, they did a study where they showed kids that were under stress, prolonged periods of stress. And they remember when we were talking neuroplasticity, how they can measure different areas of the brain, the size. They measured the volume of the prefrontal cortex, which is the front part of the brain right here, involved in decision making. They measured that in kids that were under a lot of stress. And when I say stress, I mean ugly stress, like abuse and whatnot, and kids that didn't experience high stress like that. And they found that the prefrontal cortices of these kids was smaller. And they concluded that when your body has released cortisol and you have high levels of cortisol for prolonged periods of time, you actually will eat away at your brain. Different areas of your brain actually shrink and get smaller. And that's a problem.
It's a big
That's a
problem.
major problem. These kids are going to experience all kinds of horrible things as a result of that.
Right.
They're not going to be able to sleep. They're going to be totally anxious all the time or depressed, right? Because if they stay anxious for a long period of time, the body is just going to say, "Oh, I'm done with this."
Or even the feedback they get from the world, right? Excuse me, their memories aren't working quite well, right? So they're struggling to perform basic things, and the people around them, teachers, parents, they get frustrated with them. They take it out on them, and they're getting this negative sort of reaction to they're doing the best that they can, but they just can't do these functions. And now they create anxiety on top of that, and they create negative moods and depression on top of that. And it snowballs and snowballs and snowballs.
Yeah, yeah. And so how do you, I mean, that's a hard thing to fix. And cognitive behavioral therapy works very, very well for that, in many instances, not all, but in many. Counseling and being able to get to the root of the problem, I always feel that's a good thing.
Yeah. But
Neurofeedback is
yeah.
is another great option for these
And a
kids.
lot of times what we see, at least in our maps, it indicates that there is a physiological component. And I got bad news for some people, because sometimes this toxic stress is generational. You're born with it. It's kind of handed down,
In your
unfortunately,
genes.
from generation to generation. And you're born sort of predisposed to this toxic stress. And it usually it'll affect sleep processes, but it will also affect your gut health and the gut brain axis. And if you don't address this inflammation and you don't calm this process down, it just starts to go downhill and downhill, because you then can't create healthy brain waves to function in the rest of your daily
Yeah.
life.
Addressing the gut is a primary thing when you're dealing with a child or an adult with has experienced toxic stress for a long period of
Yeah.
time.
And the
You have to
inflammation.
address the gut. I mentioned earlier how cortisol affects the brain. It doesn't just affect the brain. I mean, it suppresses your immune system. It is a culprit in many of the chronic diseases, heart disease, diabetes, things like that. And it just creates a susceptibility to a lot of different negative conditions that can really adversely affect your life. Everyone talks about the mind body connection, and we've talked about this before. The mind body connection, it's real. It's real. And when you're dealing with something like this, you can't just address one or the other. You have to address both. And that's why proper gut health, making sure that the intestinal flora are
Yeah,
the good bacteria.
I was just looking up. I wanted to give this test. This is a test that you can get ordered by your doctor. It's called a zonulin test, Zonulin, and it measures the level of zonulin, a protein that regulates the tightness of the junctions between cells in the intestinal lining. So it's a test for leaky gut. And you never hear about this test. It's been around for a long time, and it's very reliable, but it doesn't get ordered in a routine panel. And it's important to know if you have that leaky gut syndrome.
So I wasn't familiar with that test, but I'm definitely going to look that up and start using it. Excuse me. Yeah. So leaky gut, having bad intestinal flora, the microbiota that everyone talks about in the intestines, very, very important to keep that healthy. I had read a study where they're actually taking people that have, a depleted intestinal flora,
Mhm.
and they're actually, I know this sounds gross, but they're actually inserting the feces of other people that have strong intestinal flora
To help.
into the large intestine
Really?
to recultivate the intestinal flora in the large intestine.
It does sound gross.
It sounds horrible, but
Yeah.
it's really happening.
Wow.
People are doing that.
Yeah, I mean, you hear all about things right now. You have probiotics, prebiotics. One of the things that I started doing, I think, on your recommendation, was the um, bovine colostrum.
Very good for you.
Yeah,
Very, very good
and
for
that's
you.
been working really well, which kind of has a mixture of so many different things in it. And I
Yeah.
don't work for that company, so I'm just saying I like
There's
it.
a lot of different companies that make bovine colostrum, but you're starting to hear more and more people starting to use that to help with their intestinal flora. I've been using it now for about a year,
Mhm.
and it's made a difference for me for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah, yeah. It's a good product.
Yeah.
But that's what we see day in day out, and I've seen so many of them lately that it's a little scary to see so many children in toxic stress. Children should be, that should be the happy learning, absorbing
Yeah.
time of your life,
Right.
and your system shouldn't be so inflamed. And a lot of times they don't know it. People just think, oh, that's what's going on with my child. They have attention issues, they have anxiety issues, they can't learn, they can't behave. And it's not that they don't want to, and it's not that they can't. Their brain is just inflamed. There is so much toxicity and so much inflammation that they just can't get it done.
Yeah. Yeah. It's pretty scary because not only are we looking at the lives of these kids who turn into adults and maybe have children, but their children, the fact that the way they bring up their child with, with all of this toxic stress that they have, very often it becomes toxic stressful for the child as well. So you mentioned earlier, it's generational,
And then the whole family dynamic, right? And in fact, the one of the mentoring calls I did today, it was a brother and sister, and their maps were very similar. And this is not something unusual,
see that
right?
all the time.
You see it all the time, the family dynamic, and then whatever, you know, binds them together, you'll see these map patterns look very similar.
Yeah.
And you're like, all right, and which is great, which is when, when I was in practice, I had extra systems because I would just put the whole family, like, look, child here, the reason you came in here was with his child, but you, mom
You
and
need it.
dad, you need to go too. Like, everybody needs to do this
Yeah.
just to help the whole family dynamic.
Yep,
And
and it does, and it really does. So I'm curious to know, you said you were in these cases today. What did you recommend in terms of neurofeedback? What approach did you recommend?
well, in each case, there was a very obvious sleep problem.
Mm,
One of them was on the autism spectrum. So, as always, I try to stay to a very simple classic approach and just do at single channel SMR up at CZ, just
hmm.
to kind of calm that brain down. But in those cases, if they don't get this metabolic support, you might see some improvement for a time, but there is going to be a deterioration because they can't create the healthy brain patterns that stick. So it definitely needs that other component. It needs that gut health. It needs that anti-inflammatory, something to calm that process down while we build up the other process and get SMR to just calm the brain and get it more focused. So that's what I said to every one of them. It was like I was like a broken record today. And I'm like, yep, this one is the same process, and
Yeah,
let's help them sleep. I mean, if we can just get them to sleep a little
right.
bit better, I mean, everything's gonna,
Yeah, sleep is going to
help.
decrease inflammation. It's,
Right.
and that's a fact. But I'm curious to know, like, what about when you have a patient that is older, let's say, and not on the spectrum, and you got their sleep under control? What would be the next neurofeedback protocol you would
I
look
mean,
at?
it's always case by case, right? I mean, it's a functional analysis, and everybody's different. Even though we
Mhm.
see repetitive patterns, we have to address everybody as an individual. And some people have a lot of emotional trauma, so it's a social push that's creating the dysregulation, and some people have more of a metabolic push.
Mm.
If it's a psychosocial issue, it really depends. Oftentimes, we'll go right into alpha theta, where we want to just try to get that subconscious bubbling up, get rid of the junk that's in the background, and clean that out if we can. And then sometimes I like to do some asymmetry training where we try to balance the left and right side of beta and the left and right side of alpha to
Right.
its normal abnormal. It's a very confusing concept, but there is a normal asymmetry. So there's a normal imbalance, but it's the way it's supposed to be, and we want to return that, because when we see that reversed, it often means we've got negative moods, moodiness, or we've got a lot of stress, a lot of mental stress, a lot of anxiety. And, unless we shift that out and get them back and calm down, we can't move on to the next step. So those are the two approaches I use depending on the individual. Typically, is that
So
is that what you do?
yeah,
Or
yeah, that's basically what I do too. I was just curious to know if we were on the same page with that, and we are.
yeah,
So basically, overall, you have a person that comes in that's experienced toxic stress all their life, and they're presenting with certain signs. We'll do neurofeedback primarily in the beginning to get rid of the sleep, And then after that, to help with some of the deep emotional problems that they're having, I also recommend some kind of support for the gut, maybe getting a thyroid panel too, make sure that thyroid is working properly. And I also like to get them into some type of counseling or therapy, because I really think that the combination of the alpha theta with the therapy is the best combination there is. And we have a lot of mental health providers in BrainCore
that have incorporated neurofeedback, and the things that they're telling me are just amazing in terms of the results they're getting. They're getting so much better results than if they just did the therapy or the talk therapy alone. So those are all things that you can consider. You can also consider, EMDR. That's another therapy that has been shown to be effective. It's more for anxiety, right?
But it can
But
be
it's a
helpful.
good way to access your emotions without having to actually go through the nitty gritty and the details. It's more internal and guided rather than which is nothing wrong with it, but the typical talk therapy.
The good news is that we're helping a lot of people that have been suffering with toxic stress for a long time.
You know what? It's just, I think I go back to how impressive and important the brain map is, and being able to get a functional view of how the brain is working. And when you can see it, you can address it. When you can't see it, it's hard to address.
And having a qualified individual like a BrainCore practitioner or provider being able to read that map, because once again, you can get someone that doesn't know what they're doing, and they could read the map the wrong way, and they can make things a little worse. So you want to make sure you're with someone that's qualified and knows what they're doing. And I don't know about others, but I know our BrainCore providers are all highly qualified because we train them. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. That was our take on toxic stress, and
yeah,
we'll catch you next time.
All right. Take care, everybody.